The history of the English language. The English language is spoken today in parts of Europe, the Americas, Asia, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and in some of the islands of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. It is spoken as the first language by 320 million people. It is also used as a second language by about the same number of people and as a foreign language by millions more. English is probably used in some way by about a quarter of all the people in the world. Because so many people in so many places speak or use English, it is often called a world language. Our understanding of the history of English began at the end of the 18th century when Sir William Jones, a British judge who lived in India, began to study Sanskrit. People had thought that Latin, Greek, and all European languages came from Sanskrit, but Jones disagreed. The common source, the language from which all these languages developed, is now known as Proto-Indo-European. By studying languages as they are spoken today, we can see some similarities which suggest that they probably come from Proto-Indo-European. The Celts were the first group of Indo-European speakers to move across Europe. Towards the end of the 5th century BC, they began to spread out from their homeland north of the Alps in Central Europe. In the middle of the 5th century AD, people from the Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes arrived in southern and eastern Britain from what are now Germany and Denmark. They drove the British Celts into the north and west of Britain and slowly organized themselves into 7 kingdoms in what is now England and southeast Scotland. By the end of the 5th century, with more and more of the country inhabited by people from these Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, the English language began to develop. The dialects of English spoken by the first Anglo-Saxons became what we now call Old English. There were 4 main dialects of Old English: West Saxon, Kentish, Mercian, and Northumbrian. Old English was almost completely Germanic. This is probably because of the Anglo-Saxons came to Britain in large numbers and with great force. The greatest piece of literature of Old English is a long poem called Beowulf, which was probably created in the middle of the 8th century, although it was not actually written down until about 250 years later. The next great influence on the language came with a new group of invaders, the Vikings, or Danes, as the Anglo-Saxons called them. The presence of the Vikings can be seen in the modern place names of England. More than 1,500 places in northern England have Scandinavian names. At the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, King Harold was killed and his army defeated by the Norman invaders. Norman French immediately became the language of governing classes and remained so for the next 200 years. French and Latin were used in government, the church, The law and literature. Very little was written in English, although English monks did continue writing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle until 1154. The upper classes spoke French as a second language. Most ordinary people could not speak French at all and continued to speak only English. The continuing competition between English and France resulted in the Hundred Years' War. Another great event in the 14th century was the illness known as the Black Death. At last, in the 15th century, English completely replaced French in the home, in education, and in government. In the 400 years that followed the Norman conquest, the English language changed more than in any other time in its history. From the 13th century, English was used more and more in official papers and also in literature. The greatest writer of this time was Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer, who lived in London, was both a poet and an important government official. His best-known work, The Canterbury Tales, is about a group of ordinary people who journey to Canterbury together, telling each other stories on the way. Later that century, an invention was brought to England which had an enormous effect on the language. This was the printing machine, which William Caxton brought to London in 1476. By the end of the 15th century, English was starting to be read by thousands of people. The 16th century was full of changes in Europe. At the beginning of the century, Latin was the language of learning in all Europe. However, with the growth of education, the invention of printing, and the new interest in learning, this began to change. Using English meant that a writer could reach a larger audience. In 1687, Sir Isaac Newton wrote his Principia in Latin, but 15 years later he wrote Optics in English. The age of Queen Elizabeth I was one of a great flowering of literature. There were the poets Spenser and Sidney, and the writers of plays Marlowe, Jonson, and of course William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is considered the greatest writer of plays. He created about 2,000 words and a huge number of expressions which are now part of everyday English. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, she had no children, so her cousin James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, Wales, and Scotland. In 1604, he ordered a translation of the Bible into English. The King James Bible had an important influence on the English language as well. Charles I, James's first son, was killed in 1649, and England, Wales, and Scotland remained without a king until 1660, when Charles II, Charles I's son, returned to England. Charles II died in 1685, and his brother, James II, became king. But James II was so unpopular that in 1688 he left England and he was replaced by his daughter and her husband, Mary and William of Orange. All these political events made people dislike change and wish for order and regularity in their lives. And some people also wanted more regularity in their language. Some people in England also wanted to create an official organization to control the English language. One of these people was the author Jonathan Swift. Although printing had introduced some regularity in spelling, in the 16th century spelling remained very varied, even for personal names. In the 17th century, the appearance of the first English dictionaries slowly brought about more regularity in spelling. Dictionaries were not unknown in the 17th century, but they were Latin English ones. In 1755, Samuel Johnson produced a dictionary of the English language, and it was an immediate success. The discoveries and inventions in all areas of science in the last 200 years have led to new words for machines, materials, plants, animals, stars, diseases and medicines, and new expressions for scientific ideas. Most new words have been made by combining two old words, fingerprint, airport, streetwise. Some new words have been made from Latin and Greek, for example, photograph, helicopter, airplane, video. The growth in vocabulary is clear when we look at the making of the Oxford English Dictionary in the 19th and 20th centuries. James Murray, a 42-year-old Scot, was appointed as the director of the work on the dictionary in 1879. The first Oxford English Dictionary was completed in 1928 and had a total of 414,800 words. England and America are two countries separated by the same language, wrote George Bernard Shaw in 1942. In 1620, English settlers landed north of Virginia in what became Massachusetts. Sailors from Britain and other European countries were taking Africans to America and selling them as slaves. During the 17th and 18th centuries, more and more people arrived in America. English settlers created new Christian towns in Pennsylvania, and other settlers arrived from France, Germany, the Caribbean, and Northern Ireland. As the settlers moved west, they invented many colorful expressions, which are now part of British English too. For example, to face the music, which means to accept the unpleasant results of your actions, to kick the bucket, to die, to keep one's shirt on, to not get angry, and hot under the collar, angry. American English has borrowed only a few words from all the different languages spoken by American settlers. African Americans developed their own varieties of English, which are all known today as African American English. Some British people dislike the influence of American English, but this has not stopped thousands of American words entering British English and becoming completely accepted. For example, supermarket, teenager, and fast food. All over the world, people speaking English as a first or second language use different vocabulary, grammar, and accents in a large number of varieties of English. In England, as well as standard British English, there are many regional and social dialects. Outside England, in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the Irish Republic, there are other varieties of English as well. From the 17th century, regional varieties of English were taken to North America, the Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and Asia. The three main regional dialects of American English are Northern, Midland, and Southern. These reflect the movement of settlers to the west. Australian English has developed from a number of varieties of English as well. New Zealand English and South African English have some similarities to Australian English in their pronunciation because all three countries were settled by English speakers at about the same time. Other countries were also governed by the British in the 19th and 20th centuries. India, Hong Kong, Singapore, Nigeria, Kenya, Papua New Guinea. The word slang can mean several things. It can mean the words and expressions used by a particular group of people to show that they belong to the group. Language that is not acceptable in official situations because it is often too impolite or too new. Any new words or new meanings of old words that people use in everyday conversation. Slang is colorful and often funny. The Jamaican poet Derek Walcott knows that English still has a great influence on countries that were part of the British Empire. The British journalist Andrew Marr recognizes that English does not belong just to the British or Americans, but to the whole world. One guess is that the number of people who can use English well will continue to grow. Some believe that English will remain a world language. On the other hand, speakers of all the regional varieties of English will continue to create their own words, expressions, pronunciation, and grammar. The next chapter in the history of English is hard to see accurately. The world around us is changing so fast. Will we recognize the English of today in the next century? Who will use it and how? These are interesting questions for all users of English, wherever they are.